Yay! I think we are live. I don't have coffee in front of my face. That's what happened on an earlier live stream this week. I had coffee cup in the middle of my face when we went live. So, welcome to Friday. Welcome to the Rebel Roundtable. And I'm super excited if I'm totally acting nerdy is because I've got Belle Walker today. And Belle is the owner and CEO of Bellevue Consulting. And she is this genius mechanical engineer from Harvard, systems engineer from USC, and she helps us ditch the duct tape, which is what I call this. So, Belle, thank you for being here and having nerdy discussions with me on Friday mornings.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love a nerdy discussion with you, Jen.
Well, and I find that lawyers we're good at giving advice, but we're not good at taking the advice. And I think that's where you come in a lot of times is you're like, so why are we doing this? So give me a little bit of background, give the audience a little background on who you are and what you do first.
Yeah, so I like to say that I'm an organizational efficiency engineer. I take organizations from friction to function. You can see it right there in my name. So I look at the ideally invisible infrastructure that allow people in teams to actually achieve their goals. So the processes, the structures, the accountability, the roles, all of that stuff that kind of underpins how we do our work. It's not necessarily the most fun for a lot of people to talk about. Fortunately, I really enjoy it. And I really like to understand how leaders are thinking about their teams and how they're organizing. And I sometimes just talking about it brings a little clarity.
It does. It's so funny how we don't realize the things we do until someone asks a pointed question. Why do you do that? And you realize it. And I joked on the description to this. I said, you know how when you start to draft a document, you're like, oh, I remember a case from 1982 that had the similar fact pattern. And I'm going to go pull up that template that I used then. And that's your whole process. And then you can't train anybody because they don't know what's in your brain. They don't know those invisible things. So um, we've talked that most law firms don't actually have real processes. Even big law firms sometimes don't have really great processes. What do you think? Why do you think that is? Like, what's the background on why law firms don't have real processes?
My guess is that often when people think about process and adding in structure, we tend to approach these conversations selfishly, right? So a lawyer, a partner is going to think in terms of putting structure in for the work that they're doing. So even in your example, right, thinking about a case, pulling that knowledge from your brain. From my perspective, in many ways, I when I do processes, that all gets hidden in one box that if I'm working with a client that will let me, I will happily call do the law stuff, right? That part, that expertise, honestly doesn't processize super well.
Yeah,
What you really want to add your process to is everything around that, right? How did your onboarding happen? How did that client first experience your firm? How did they schedule the conversations? How were they supported? How are they being kept up to date as you work that lawyerly magic? In a perfect world, you would also be training the more junior folks in your firm how to find that research, that precedence. I don't know. This is law stuff, right? This is not my area of expertise. But what you can do is make sure that you have a clear library. What are the templates you're using? If you're trying to pull something up from 1982, how do you go about making it actually work in the modern templates with the modern precedents, whatever you actually need?
yeah,
And so I think giving people the freedom and the grace to say, the expertise part is not what we're trying to make a process around. It's
right.
everything that enables the lawyers to focus on that expertise. That's where process is going to be most effective, but it requires taking a step back from what you as a partner are doing every day and thinking about all the other stuff. And one, often that's not fun. That's why you have other people doing the other stuff. And two, then it's easy to slip back into the all of that work you went to law school for and have trained for decades and decades. And then it gets overwhelming and you don't want to do process anymore. And so then everything shuts down. So that's my very long answer about why. I think process often doesn't exist even in large law firms.
And I think what I've seen a lot with law firms and other organizations, and it's not just law firms, it's we won't just pick on law firms, but it's easy to, is that there's this mindset of, oh, I did this once, so this is how I did it, and it should stay that way. And processes, I think, should be evolving as new technology is added. And I think that that's been kind of a mindset shift, maybe in the legal industry. Are you seeing that as well?
A little bit, yeah. It's I think you and I have talked about that tendency to take what is done on paper and then literally pick it up and drop it into a digital form. And
Mm-hmm.
this is where, before we went live, you and I were talking a little bit about this notion of duct tape
Yep.
and how my sort of gut response to that statement was, but duct tape is so useful. You don't want to ditch duct tape forever. You want to have duct tape on hand. You want to use it when there's a short-term problem and get everything immediately solved. And then you want to go back and find the right answer so that you've got no duct tape in your long-term
Right.
operations. And so when we talk about that sort of lift and shift for the pre-digitization into a digital world, that's a great example of duct tape. It's almost certainly a heck of a lot better than sticking with paper. Don't not do it just because it's not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And don't stop just when you have done that one step.
And I think that's what gets missed. I wrote an article, I think a month ago or so about this, where all of these law firms have taken whatever they did on paper, whatever their process was, and then digitized it. And I gave some examples like their client intake. They just take their intake form and then they create a PDF of it, and now it's digital. But
Right.
now it doesn't match the new system or the technology is updated. And I think that gets missed. Like it seems like it's common sense to me, but I think that gets missed a lot where you have to actually go back and rethink the process first and then apply the technology. And I think that's where you come in a lot of times is like, what should the process be?
Yeah. Right. And what is the process that you're moving over? Right. There's many ways you can break something that is currently working. One is to, add pieces in that you don't need. Another is to miss pieces that you do need, or to overlook, to keep something you no longer need. So all of this is kind of a long way of saying that if you don't take the time to think about what your current process is, it's unfortunately easy to end up with a new process that is missing something entirely. And I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of. If I try to rethink the process, I'm going to lose this, all this work that I've done where I've learned what pieces are what I need.
Yeah.
Also, if you don't rethink the process, then you end up with, a step that served you 5 years ago, but now this sort of meticulous record that you're keeping on the paper log is taking a ton of time. Or to use a recent example that Jen, that you may recognize, you're having to spend 3 hours unstapling papers every month.
Yes.
I why was and somebody else had to spend an hour stapling in the first place, right? There's ways around this. We don't need to do the digital equivalent of stapling and unstapling. Let's
Right.
find a way to take those digital files and just put them in the right place to begin with.
Yeah. And I think that's some of this is generational too. You and I have talked about the generational differences in technology and things like that. And sometimes it's, I just don't want to update because that's a mindset thing. And so once a law firm has at least admitted, or what's the biggest shift that happens when they start seeing their law firm as more of an organization of systems? What do you see start happening with those types of leaders?
I see those leaders looking for ways to make those systems work for them and their teams.
Yeah.
I think that, honestly, my favorite leaders see their organizations as collections of humans first, right? Not
Yeah.
just law generating machines. And then the systems are what empower and enable. So, as much as I love systems and that's where I focus, they're tools, they're means to an end. And so focusing on that end of, very cliched, happy, productive employees, there's a reason it's a cliche. It's a great thing. And so if you can get your systems to work towards that end, I think for me, that's what the real unlock tends to be is, well, I know I want, my life to
Yeah,
look like this. And some people want their life to look like working 80 hours a week. Cool. And even those people usually want those 80 hours to be fun and productive,
right.
not
Frustrating.
painful and agonizing for 80 hours a week. So it's that, what I expect from myself, what I expect from my team. Okay, now how do I make the most of that? That's what the systems and processes come in, and that aha moment of I can get what I want by focusing on the underlying systems
Mhm.
has a real accelerating effect.
And I think too, realizing that, and we're talking a lot of mindset stuff before I actually talk process, but a lot of this is getting someone into the mindset of constant innovation and thinking about processes. And I think a lot of people, not necessarily the attorneys in firms, maybe the support staff, worry that they are somehow being replaced. Like it's that fear of that they're working themselves out of a job. And I'm always trying to emphasize that there are so many more things that are valuable they could be doing. They weren't wasting 3 hours unstabling something. So that's some of that comes into this too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it would be disingenuous to say that you're never going to hit the bottom of the work stack, right? There are times where there is less work that needs doing than there is capacity to do it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm willing to bet that 95% of everyone listening to this is not in that situation, probably even 98, 99%. What's actually going on is you've got a to-do list that is 8 miles long, and you feel really good if you are getting 20% of that to-do list done in any given day. And so that's what I try to emphasize to folks is, yeah, you may very well be working yourself out of the stuff you are currently doing on your to-do list. But what about all the other things? Those probably should get done too. There's a reason they ended up on the list. Or conversely, the 50 things that are not getting done, maybe that's what you can automate or systematize so that you don't have to stress about it, right? It happens, but it's so rare that there is actually a gap in terms of what needs doing in the underutilized way. So it's not about working yourself out of a job. It's about being more conscious and intentional about where your time is going and what the systems are doing for you.
Yeah. So let's get into some nuts and bolts here. Like when you go into a firm and start looking at that, where do you even start? What's like if someone but I like to give people like visuals of like what does this actually look like? Because it's a lot of theory sometimes, but what does it actually look like when you go into a firm?
Yeah. So this is if we're going to get nerdy about this, right? Process mapping as a tool is something that a lot of people use. And I love talking to other practitioners because we all have our own style, both in how we gather the information and how we draw the maps, etc. So I am a big fan of parallel conversation. So speaking
Mm-hmm.
of things that sound ragingly inefficient, talking to each person individually as much as possible is where I like to start. And the reason for that is I have learned that when I have the same conversation with three different people, almost everything I need to know comes up in those three conversations in the discrepancies. What did this person say that this person didn't? What did they both say but that slightly disagrees? What's the giant gap that clearly there's a step here but nobody actually told me about it? And when you get all three of those people in a room and you ask them to walk through the process together, you get a little bit of a group think. So one person says, "Oh, we do this," and everyone else is like, "Oh yeah, that's what the manual said. Yeah, yeah, we do that. We do that."
Yes.
Whereas without that audience, sometimes I can get a little more honesty or a little more transparency. And so that's my approach. I like to sit down and figure out who's involved in a given process. I want to sit down with not necessarily everyone, but a representative sample of the people involved in the process and hear from each of them how do they see the process, their parts, the other people's parts, what's input, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and then bring those pieces together so that we can then all come back to a consolidated view and look at where are those discrepancies and where does everyone agree and what makes sense and what is giant question marks.
And I think, and I've worked with you. So to be candid with audience, I've worked with Belle personally. I've worked with her professionally. I've worked in various organizations. We tag team very well on things. And one of the things that Belle has always been very good at with all of our work that we've done together is focusing on those frustrations, like finding the things that, if you could get one thing off your plate type discussions, what would it be? And I think that often identifies your underlying issues that people are like, oh, yeah, I didn't realize that I hate my job because this particular thing was happening. So I do appreciate that you have a way of doing that through all the conversations.
I like to try and bring a little bit of humor into it as well. I have been known to ask questions like, what are you going to be very annoyed if I come back and don't fix? Because when I
Yes.
phrase it that way, people are like, huh, what am I going to be? It makes them stop and reflect a little more. Also, what are you going to be annoyed if I come back and change?
Yeah.
And that's something that I think a lot of people tend to overlook when they're doing process and efficiency
Yeah.
projects reviews. They say, oh, well, we're here because something is broken, so we're here to fix. And you do run the risk of breaking things that aren't broken.
Right.
And sometimes you need to, right? Part of why I asked that question is not because I'm promising not to change something that's working well, but
Right.
I feel like it's only appropriate if I am going to change something that's working well that I explain why, right? And make it clear what the overall benefit is. I think that's where a lot of the resistance I see to these projects for the folks on the front line who actually now have to change the work that they're doing, that resistance tends to come from not appreciating because no one told them why these changes are happening. And so, it's not actually that uncommon that I will come in and say, hey, accountant A, I actually need you to do more work here. This is going to get slightly more annoying for you
Right.
in as we evolve this process. However, it's because if you can do this one extra thing, these four people now no longer have to make a change. And when you can put it in that perspective, often accountant A likes those four people, happy to do a little bit more to make their lives all easier. But if you just come in and say, hey, do this extra thing,
Yeah.
doesn't tend to go over super well.
Well, and I think that's where it comes back to your friction to function is yes, we're talking about systems, but we're also talking about people. And that communication is often missed. That I think the great process mappers of the world out there focus on how we're communicating these changes and why this makes sense instead of just like a dictator style of the CEO comes in and says, this is what we're doing now. Never goes over well, in my experience. But it's
Well,
important to consider the people.
and that's part of why I love process maps so much because you can follow the arrow and say, hey, this box is you. You don't do anything after this box. But let's go down the stream and see what your colleagues are doing, what's happening, and what the implications are, and what's happening upstream, right? I was just doing a talk yesterday, and this came up a couple times, different examples of um, what I think of as local improvements that
Mm-hmm.
didn't get propagated to the rest of the system. So an organization looked at the work they were doing, found ways to, in one example, to just build a particular cost into their project pricing, and the savings from not having to nickel and dime and track that particular, this was actually a printing cost, right? Which
Yeah.
I imagine used to be a big thing for a lot of law firms. They no longer had the printing cost as a separate, but nobody told the folks at the copier
Right.
that they didn't need to track this information anymore. So there was a physical log at the copy machine where everyone had to go track the case numbers, and it was just taking forever to make sure they had everything exactly correct and logged. No one's using this information.
Yes. It's
So
no
it's not
longer,
just
yeah.
about making, your piece of the puzzle better. And the folks downstream, it's also looking upstream and saying, hey, look, I just saved you some time. Hooray.
Yep. What are some of the most common gaps? I know we talked a little bit about like the legal stuff itself isn't usually the gap, it's the stuff around it. But and I know you've done some billing and some standard processes like that. But what do you see as gaps in those law firms?
I would say the single most common gap I see is a lack of clarity around client communication cadences,
Yep.
right? Whether that is at the prospect stage or during the case, having a clearly articulated expectation for who is reaching out to the client, when, and why.
Mhm.
It's not, honestly, it's not that complicated usually. It's often something like, if it's been 2 weeks, give them
Yeah.
a call or send them an email or whatever your client standard is. And that's a great example of the kind of thing that's often in the head of the partner. Well, of course, we want to communicate with them. Of course, my paralegal or my,
Right.
assistant or who, of course, my whoever, the fact that there are these options as part of the problem
Right.
will be reaching out. You do have to tell them to do that or ask.
And I see that so often. And the number one bar complaint out there is lack of communication from the law firm. Um, Not getting into trust account issues, because that's usually the number one reason attorneys are disbarred, is because of trust account issues. But lack of communication from the lawyer, which is such a simple thing, like you think, well, just talk to your client. But then they don't have the systems in place, or they think someone else is doing it as part of their firm, or they don't have a good answer, and we tend to procrastinate because we don't have the answer that the client wants to hear. I think I see too sometimes.
Yeah,
So
and I mean that totally resonates with me, right? As a consultant, sometimes you don't have an update, and so you don't want to reach out just to say, I don't have an update. And again, this is part of where process can be so valuable because in
yeah,
the abstract, it's really easy to say, oh, yes, even if we don't have an update, we should reach out and say, we don't have an update for you. And if
right.
you make that decision in that comfort zone, it can make it easier, especially if it's something you're delegating,
Mm-hmm.
to then have your team reach out and say, hey, just so you know, we are continuing to work on this. We
Yep.
have not forgotten about you.
Yep.
Right. And when I say it like this in the abstract, you're probably all nodding your heads going, yeah, that seems reasonable.
And this can be automated too. Like a lot of
Right.
this, like an automated drip campaign that goes out to a certain set of clients. There's all kinds of things that can be done to automate it, but you have to know what the process is first before you start frankenstacking this technology on top of it. That's my pet
And
peeve.
and being a little careful about your automations to make sure that they adapt as reality changes,
Yes.
right? If you have an
Yep.
automated email, it's going to go out every 2 weeks saying, I know you haven't heard from us.
Yep.
We promise we haven't forgotten you.
Yep.
If you sent them an email the day before, it's a little awkward then if the
Exactly.
automated message goes out.
You have to make sure it all fits together, and you have to test it and actually look at it and not just set it and
Forget
pray
it.
or whatever we do with our automations.
Well, and
Um,
I think that's one of the other really important points around process
mhm.
mapping, process optimization. 80 to 90% of the value you're going to get from any sort of project is going to be in the project itself, right? The
Yeah.
looking at it, the scrutinizing, the documenting. Only 10 to 20% of the value is then having that process documented because it does take active effort for people to go and look things up and dive back in. And
Yeah.
so what I always recommend is setting a time on the calendar when you're going to come back and revisit.
Yep.
Because also it's the world changes, the world evolves. I used to do this, right? Things change really, really slowly, and any given increment of my hands moving, not really noticeable, but now all of a sudden I'm this far apart. And so
Hmm.
if you do yourself the favor, instead of just constantly trying to track, oh, there was a change, there was a change, there was a change, it's actually going to be more effective if you get a process you really like and then come back in 3, 6, even 12 months and say, hey, are we here? Are we
Yeah.
here? Are we here? Okay, let's get back to where we want to be so that
Yeah.
we're in alignment.
And that investment in that process mapping is not like a small thing. There's time, there's money involved, but the long-term ROI on doing that is huge. And actually, resale of your law firm is like a big part of this. It gives you the ability to sell what you have instead of no one wanting to buy your disorganized crap, for lack of a better term. Um, so I have to ask you something that's come up recently in a lot of my presentations I've done is I will have either frontline staff or middle managers there. And they're like, we're all on board. We think this is great. We would love to systematize what we're doing. How do we get our leadership to even consider this or listen to? Do you have any good like ways of doing that, to getting the leadership brains?
I mean, probably the easiest is to get someone like you or me in to just talk to the leaders for CLE credit or whatever. And so that is one thing actually to that staff and paralegals should be aware of, right? This information can be delivered for CLE credit, right? It's not just a way to spend some time. It is, there is continuing education. You can get that immediate benefit from. That being said, I think making clear that where we started, right? You're not asking the partners to systematize or change or digitize whatever the law stuff,
Right.
right? You're not trying to get at the heart of what they do. You're trying to make sure that everything around that lawyerly work is working better. And I know very few partners, especially in firms with antiquated systems and tools, who are raving about how great their processes are. And so if you can help them see this is not about their core work, this is about your work and how you want to support them better, that might go over a little more smoothly than why do we sell the fax machine?
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago after one of the presentations, and it was like, if you are in leadership and you're not willing to listen to any of this, I will convince your staff to leave, not by convincing them to leave, but by showing them what's out there, that there are firms and companies willing to look at these things and take their strengths into consideration when designing and working with them. So I was causing problems again, but yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I will say when in doubt, the more you can tap into that sort of whiffum, the what's in it for me mentality. If you're trying to convince the partners, explain to them what's in it for them, right? And not just the we won't leave part of it, but truly the, oh, you wish I did this thing faster? Let me show you. If I had this tool, I could do this faster.
Yep. Yep. Because there's some great support staff out there. And a lot of law firms are running on support staff and they have great ideas. And I think listening to them and bringing them in as like equals on a team is really important. So one more thing, because I know we're getting close to the end, but we could go on for like days and days and days discussing this. The other thing that it's really funny how things come up repeatedly all at once. And then you're like, okay, we should start looking at this more. It's very much a theme. Lawyers doing things they shouldn't be doing, like who owns what in the roles, and being willing to give up some of that administrative work or things they shouldn't be doing. I find it's really hard to know what those things are until you look at the actual process. Or do you see the same things? Do you help with some of that, like who's doing what type thing?
Yeah, I do see that. That's some of my favorite work, even more than
Yeah.
process mapping, the who's doing what, who should do what. Process mapping is a great way to unlock some of those conversations. And
Yeah.
then my experience has been that the more you can articulate the out like what makes a good deliverable,
Yeah.
the easier that delegation becomes. And I emphasize that because I think often what happens is, well, I'm doing this administrative task, but nobody else knows how to do it as well as I do.
Yeah.
And distinguishing between how you're doing it and the outcome at the end of it, honestly, does it matter if someone on your staff takes 3 times as long to do it for 3 months while they really get the hang of it, but you save your time all of those 3 months, right?
Right.
That's really accepting. Yes, it will be less efficient, but is it less efficient at the firm level? Coming back to that same question with automation,
Yep.
is it going to allow you to do something else on your giant to-do list? The other major blocker I tend to see is that those kinds of tasks are the ones that we can check the box on. And that's
Mm-hmm.
a huge barrier to wanting to delegate and let go. The
Yep.
more sort of strategic and high level your work becomes, the more you're spending time researching a case but not actually ready to write or get into trial, or whatever that deliverable is. That thought work in any aspect of a business or a profession can feel very slow and unfulfilling in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Most people like to check boxes, whether it's physically creating a list and checking boxes or just knowing that they accomplished something. And
Yeah.
so finding other ways, or even just acknowledging, I am doing this because it lets me check a box. Sometimes there are small things that are worth keeping
Yeah.
just for your own mental health to let you check a box. Often, the vast majority of it, pass it along, let somebody else check the box, move on with
Mm-hmm.
your day.
I agree. And I think, oh, and law lawyers have trust issues. And I think some of it goes back to, I do it this way. So if they don't do it this way, but when it's really the deliverable, the outcome that's important, not like exactly how you do it correctly. So very good point. Belle, if people want to reach out to you, how do they find you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. Belle Walker is probably Belle K Walker is the direct URL on LinkedIn, or you can find lots of information on bellevueconsulting.com, and it's BelleView because it's my view of the world. Bellevueconsulting.com.
Thank you. And I'll also put that in the description when I post the final notes here. But also on the Rebel Roundtable, we have your Rebel anthems. We have a Spotify playlist that is all of the Rebel Roundtable guests' anthems when they need to either pump themselves up or just have a Rebel anthem. What is your Rebel anthem? Do you remember?
I have to say, I don't have a consistent one. It is different every
That's okay.
day. Um, Yeah, so today's Rebel anthem,
Yeah.
honestly, it's Party in the USA. I just need just need to get moving, get excited. It's got nothing to do with anything, but it gets me pumped up.
That's, I mean, there are songs like that. Like when you're a kid, like you have these songs that you like sing along to and you don't realize what the words actually mean. And now you look back like, my kids can't sing this. But it's the truth. It's like it's the beat or the rhythm or something that gets your blood pumping. It's not necessarily that it's a meaningful song in any
Or hi
way.
to everyone else my generation that had all of Rent memorized in sixth grade.
Very appropriate for sixth
Yeah.
grade. That's great. Well, thank you for contributing to our Rebel Anthem playlist. And I like Party in the USA too, just as far as a get going song. So
Yeah.
get that added. I have a feeling there will be a follow up to our discussion, and we'll get you back on the calendar later this year to continue. But thank you so much for being here. Any last final words of wisdom for our reluctant process mappers out there in law firms?
You can always start just documenting for yourself. It's a great place, even if you're not ready to expose that process to the world, just writing it down can help you see things you may not have seen before. So it's never too late or too early to start documenting.
Very good. Thank you.
Not inspiring, but true.
It's never too late. So start, because I have people like, oh, I want to sell my firm in a year or two. I'm like, great. Now is a great time to do this. So thank you. Um, Belle, thank you. I really appreciate all of your help. And I really am so glad we connected as many years ago as we did. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. And the Rebel Roundtable is the place to find people that are doing things a little bit differently. So I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Have a
Jen.
good day, everyone. We'll see you all next Friday at 9 a.m.